So, what are the principles of Old Testament hermeneutics? What are the principles of OT hermeneutics? Of course, we said hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. By now, everybody knows this. I want to start by defining biblical hermeneutics, because both OT and NT make the Bible. So, biblical hermeneutics is about OT and NT hermeneutics. So, they are all sciences of interpretations. And as we shall see, the Protestants have their own principles of hermeneutics. The Roman Catholics have their own principles of biblical hermeneutics in general, not necessarily OT or NT, generally. The Eastern Orthodox have their own principles of biblical hermeneutics. Again, Pentecostals, Afro-Pentecostals, as we call African Pentecostalism, they have their own principles of OT hermeneutics. So where do we go? The question is, we have to get the general and then the specific. And that is the purpose of this lecture. Now, biblical hermeneutics is a study of the principles of interpretation concerning the books of the Bible. It is part of the broader field of hermeneutics, which involves the study of principles of interpretation, both theory and methodology, for all forms of communication, non-verbal and verbal. Now, the objective of this lesson today is to orientate you, the learner, on the key principles of doing Old Testament hermeneutics, even if we understand there are various schools of addressing this very subject. Number one, the general principles now first, before we go to the specifics. One principle is the mind of the author, akili ya mwandishi wa kile kitabu, whether it is the book of James or the book of now in OT we talk of Exodus or Pentateuch or the Torah, the book of Moses, said to have been written by Moses, or Nevim or Ketuvim, wisdom books. Of course, OT is composed of 3 books. There is the law books or Torah books written by Moses, the 5 of them. There is also Ketuvim or the wisdom books, and there is also, and of course, Nevim is not wisdom, it means prophets. The prophetic books and the wisdom books and the law books, there are 3. The law books, the prophetic books, and the wisdom books. Of course, when you go to the New Testament, there are 4 books. There is the Gospels, there is also letters. There's a letter, there's the Gospel, there is letters, there is Acts of Apostles, and there's also the book of Revelation. So you can see there are about 7 books, the clustering. Now, what we are talking about when we talk about the key principles of doing the Old Testament hermeneutics, we are talking about 3 major points. 1, the mind of the author. Number 2, the text in isolation. Number 3, the mind of the reader. So, coming to the mind of the author, the traditional approach of conservative interpreters of the Bible, though often unexpressed, has been to emphasize the mind of the human author. This method assumes that the author understood what he was writing, that under the direction of the Holy Spirit, he shaped his text for a particular audience, and that he expected his audience to understand what he was communicating. For that reason, biblical hermeneutics normally deals with the historical, cultural context of the author to determine from what perspective the statements of the text were made by the author and understood by the targeted audience. Now, the lexical and syntactical information is studied to determine how words and expressions were used by that particular author in distinction from other authors. Also, figures of speech are studied both within the historical context of the period and within the body of text by a given author. In recent studies, as will be noted below, attention has been focused on the literary styles and the genres chosen by authors as a major factor in determining authorial intent. This approach assumes that the author of a text determines its meaning. So you cannot understand a text without first trying to read the mind of the author. Who was he targeting? Is it exiles in Babylonian captivity? Is it the Egyptian captivity or oppression under Pharaoh? Is it the reign of Nebuchadnezzar? When was it that time? Who was the target? Is it the time of King Cyrus? Is it the time of David at Goliath? That is the mind of the author. You have to understand it in order to be honest and to honestly understand the OT. The second one is a text in isolation. That is, treatment of a text in total isolation from both the author and the reader is probably impossible, but various attempts have been made to separate the text from all external factors. This approach detaches the text from its historical source and setting and frees the text to mean what it will in any given time and culture. Therefore, the meanings of words are taken as what would be normative in the time and place of reading, not the time of writing. So that isolating the text or text in isolation is all about trying to understand the text in the very specific place where you are reading it, so that something that was written 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, does not become relevant. So it has to be read normatively within the time and the place of reading in mind. So it has to be isolated in order to communicate or to draw the relevance of the particular moment. Now, this approach assumes that meaning is a factor of written sentences, neither the intention of the author nor the bias of the reader. Interestingly, this emphasis often insinuates itself into the hermeneutics of readers who assume that the biblical authors wrote in the same linear fashion as modern Western writers. Now, typical sermon outlines reflect this very wrong bias, because those times it was written were different historical times, and because there were different historical times, we have to consider all these things when we are now trying to read the Old Testament and do our hermeneutics, our own interpretation. The third general point is the mind of the reader. We had the mind of the author, we had the way of isolating the text isolation in order to communicate to a particular people in the 21st century, for example. And now we have the mind of the reader himself or herself in the 21st century, or whatever century that will be. That is critical principle in reading the OT. Largely as a result of postmodern influences, the most rapidly developing trend within biblical hermeneutics emphasize the role of the reader in determining the meaning of a text. Now, this emphasis ranges from simple admission that all readers bring biases or presuppositions to the reading of a text. Everyone brings into the biblical text the baggage of biasness, the baggage of prepossessions, and therefore to assertion that the only meaning in a text is that which the reader gives it. Now, words and sentences have no meaning until they are processed by a mind. So you have to process it so that you can know what kind of bias have I brought forward in the Bible. Could I be informed? And that's why some evangelicals will tell you pray first before you read the Bible, because you could be bringing your own bias, and at the end of it all, you mess it up. So the degree to which that act of processing determines meaning is a question which this approach attempts to answer. Whereas the method that seeks to determine the original intention of the author lends itself to a separation of original meaning and present application. Reader-centered interpretation tends to blur that distinction. In its most extreme form, this hermeneutic becomes purely a matter of identifying. It becomes a matter of identifying, and I want to stop there briefly. I'll come back.